afternoon, everybody. I'm Ruth Chambers from Greener UK, the Environmental NGO Coalition, and we're delighted to be hosting this very timely event on environmental governance. What's the picture across the UK? And in a few minutes, we are privileged to be hearing from representatives from the four bodies that are charged with looking after our environmental governance. We have Dame Glenys Stacey, Chair of the Office for Environmental Protection first. Then we'll hear from Jim Martin, Chair of Environmental Standards Scotland, followed by Nerys Llewellyn-Jones, the Interim Environmental Protection Assessor for Wales, and finally Markham Beatty, who's the non-executive member for Northern Ireland on the Office for Environmental Protection. So, as I say, this event is very timely. The environmental governance systems are still bedding down, I think it's fair to say, across the UK, but it couldn't be a better time to take some space and have a discussion with these experts. So first of all, I'm going to invite Dame Glenys to speak for about 10 minutes. And after that, we'll hear from the other speakers, move into a panel discussion, and then there'll be about 15 minutes for a Q&A before we close in an hour and a quarter's time. So start thinking up your questions, and please use the Q&A function to do that. And if you want to chat amongst yourselves, as it were, then the chat function is open too. Over to you, Dame Glenys.
Thank you very much. And thank you so much for this kind invitation to speak today to any number of people out there. Thank you. So I'm delighted to be here and to have a chance to really talk. I'm going to try and keep what I say pretty short so that we get a chance for a good exchange when others have spoken. But let me start by saying that the OEP has just celebrated its first birthday, and what a year it has been. You know, if you look back, we've had a sort of perma crisis, haven't we? 3 prime ministers, 3 secretaries of state, a war, you know, an ongoing war, a cost of living crisis, difficulties with our NHS, and now a winter seemingly of discontent. So it's not been an uneventful year out there, has it? But for us in the OEP, well, we're a year old. I still think of us as fledgling, you know, not yet fully kind of fledged, but getting there. And we know from the research we've done most recently that we are beginning to be seen as an independent, expert and strategic organisation. And that's what we set out to be in order to be credible for you. And so I'm really pleased so far, I think, with the progress that we've been making. When I ask myself, well, what have we actually done apart from creating an organisation, which in itself is a task? Well, in May last year, we published our Taking Stock report, really advising government on the building blocks we thought were necessary in order to get to a better environmental improvement plan. Back in June, we published our strategy and our enforcement policy, as the Act obliges us to do, the Environment Act. But many of you will note that it was just a day later that we launched our first investigation into water quality. And then over the past year, we have been providing several pieces of advice to government on biodiversity net gain, for example, on the Nature Recovery Green Paper and the Northern Ireland EIP, just to give you a few examples. And we've also engaged heavily with parliamentary committees, submitting evidence to government and to parliamentary committees. So, for example, on the Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill and the retained EU Law Bill. Now, many of you keen observers will have noticed that we didn't hesitate to highlight a regrettable, let's call it culture of delay in DEFRA, as they missed the deadline for publishing the expected statutory environmental targets. And we continue to press, indeed, for DEFRA to continue to deliver as it is required by statute in a range of environmental areas. So we're now sort of 1 month into 2023, and we've already hit an important milestone for us, publication of our first statutory report on government's progress against its 25-year plan. And many of you will have seen it and know that it doesn't contain a lot of good news, actually, but it does rely entirely on government data. It is actually acting as a mirror and reflecting back to government what we think the data that government has collected tells it about the state of the environment. And we've assessed a good number of trends there, 32, I think, and 23 environmental targets. So it's a comprehensive picture. If I were a Secretary of State, I'd actually quite like that, because it's a sort of baseline, isn't it? When we did the EIP 5 years ago, government didn't have a baseline. Well, it might be in a better position now than it was 5 years ago. Now we're all anticipating the next EIP, aren't we? And I think I would say that we've had a real focus on that at the OEP from the very beginning. You know, much of our work, and certainly our 2 big piece reports, if you like, have been entirely focused on that. So I do feel very keen to see, you know, what the final piece looks like. And that will be with us hopefully next week. So we're all anxious to see that. I'm hoping, of course, that much of our advice to government on how to plan well and organise well for the environment has been listened to, has been adopted, but we haven't long to wait now before we actually find out. If I can just then look at the OEP in the broader context, if Ruth, you're interested in how governance is going for the environment, I think it's a mixed picture. So government has set up an independent oversight body, the OEP, and of course I'm thankful for that, and I think it's a huge step forward for governance. But I often talk of the 4 cornerstones, the governance cornerstones that are embedded in the Environment Act. Were one of those cornerstones were there. The next cornerstone is the statutory targets. And at last we do have those, but I think you could say it was a difficult birth, wasn't it? But we've got those now. So that's 2 out of the 4 cornerstones there. The third one is the Environmental Improvement Plan, and hopefully we'll see that next week. And then last but not least, the Environmental Principles Policy Statement. Now that's been long in the coming, hasn't it? And actually the Environment Act doesn't put a deadline on when that needs to be there. So it's not that they're missing a deadline, but it is taking an awful long time. And I'm hoping that alongside the EIP next week, we'll also see a really good all singing, all dancing environmental EPPS, so that we can make sure that all government departments are properly bought in, if you like, to what's to be delivered under the EIP. A couple more things. I do think, well, I know for a fact that the OEP will be very interested, actively interested in how that EPPS will be monitored. You know, we don't want it to be stuck on a shelf in each department. You know, we want actual evidence of consistent application of the Environmental Principles Policy Statement in all departments. And we will be looking at that particularly in the year ahead, because if there's any recalcitrance, we'll want to really pick that up early and remind government firmly of what is required. So we're not, you know, through the woods yet, if you like, in relation to the EPPS, even if it comes out next week. Sticking with governance, I'd just like to make 2 more points, I think. One is in both of our reports, both the Taking Stock report in May and our more recent review of environmental progress, we've made the clear point that any EIP is not just DEFRA's baby, that, you know, for government to deliver on its ambitions for the environment, it's really got to get cross-government buy-in and ownership and cross-government governance arrangements. So that is a big gap if you're looking, Ruth, at governance and how well are we set up actually now to bring about government's ambitions for the environment. There needs, in our view, to be a mechanism for doing that, which is a mechanism that's empowered to make things happen. Now, we've made one proposition for that in our last report, a sort of Aunt Sally, if you like, but we are showing government one way it could be done. There are other ways. And what I'm really keen to see is that governance gap plugged, and I hope it will be plugged next week when we get the next EIP. One last thing, and that is about statutory deadlines. So, as I've mentioned, we've been rather on DEFRA's tail in relation to chasing those statutory targets, but there are other deadlines missed. Too many other statutory deadlines missed, and that doesn't seem to us to be at all right, you know, given that these are statutory deadlines often set by by this government. So we are doing more work on that. We are chasing DEFRA and other relevant departments to see where they think they are in relation to meeting deadlines that are already delayed. And we are building a tracker, if you like, that shows not just missed but upcoming deadlines, so we can have a bit of foresight, you know, and see ahead of time whether we can nudge the right people in the right departments to get things done. And an initial priority for us in this field of work is to produce and lay before Parliament an environmental law report on post-implementation reviews. Yeah, now some of you will know that's a requirement that much of policy is actually reviewed post-implementation. And it really is important at the moment, isn't it? If you think in the context of plan reform to environmental law in England, notably through the rule, and it seems to be really helpful to see what evidence government has about the efficaciousness of current policy before, you know, there are decisions made perhaps to scrap it, replace it, change it, enhance it, or whatever. So I don't want people participating here to think that because we chased up on statutory deadlines that we would be losing interest in more general compliance with the law and timely compliance. Not at all. I'll stop there because my time is probably running out, but I'm really looking forward to the subsequent debate and what others have to say. Thank you, Ruth. Thank you.
Thanks, Dame Glenys. Lots to pick up on there in the discussion. Great to hear about the tracker. I'm sure we can come back to some of those things. So now I'd like to move on to hear from Jim Martin, the Chair of Environmental Standards Scotland, which is the new oversight body that's been set up to really watch over the Scottish Government's environmental progress and laws. So Jim, if I can invite you to put your camera on and make your remarks, please. Thank you.
Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. We're in a slightly different position to the one that Glenys has described for OEP. ESS is a creature of the Scottish Parliament, and it was born out of Brexit because the role of the European Commission and looking at cases which were brought to us is no longer one that we can use. So ESS was in fact brought into place, into being, so that we could look at the compliance of public bodies with EU law, but most importantly, the effectiveness of environmental law in Scotland. And the Scottish Government, in their plan, which Parliament approved, has also given us a duty to assess whether the Scottish Government is keeping pace with international developments, particularly with developments in the European Union. So we're very, very keen to ensure our independence of both Scottish Government and Scottish Parliament. We're not there to deliver their programmes, we're there to scrutinise their performance and the effectiveness of the laws in the statute book. We managed to vest in 9 months. We're nearly there with getting our full cohort of people on board, and all the functions that we have are now up and running and working pretty well. We produced a strategic plan, which has been approved by the Scottish Parliament. It was formally approved in December. And that plan sets out our priorities and how we intend to go about our business. And I have to say thanks to so many people, including many of the NGOs, I'm sure, who are participating in this discussion today, for their input. At the very beginning, we said that we wanted to be very open, very transparent, and we wanted to hear from others about how they thought we should be going about our business. And we were very, very encouraged both by the quantity of the input we had, but also the quality. And we've tried very hard to take a lot of these points on board. And I'm pleased to say that our strategic plan was very well received. Since we've been up and running the last 15 months or so, we've had 22 representations, which are approaches to us to conduct investigations. And we've conducted and concluded 7 investigations across a range of areas, ranging from the use of acoustic deterrent devices, particularly in finfish farming, on Ramsar wetlands, and our first improvement report on air quality. Now, the power that we have to issue an improvement report means that the public body, and in this case, the Scottish Government, is required to comply with that report. And within a period of time that is specified, they have to explain how they're going to carry out the improvements that we have suggested. And these improvements have to be presented to the Scottish Parliament, who needs to approve them. So it's a very considerable power. And I'm pleased to say that our first report on air quality has been very well received. Scottish Government has agreed with all of the recommendations in the improvement report, and are due in the next few weeks to produce a report for the Scottish Parliament's approval, which will include how they intend to improve the monitoring of performance and air quality in Scotland. So that's a very big first win. I'm pleased to say that we managed to get most of our investigations resolved through informal resolution with public bodies concerned. That's very important because it avoids lengthy delays in trying to get improvements implemented. And it also means that we can get discussion and agreement with public bodies on how they can improve without having to go through bureaucratic processes. So, for example, in the acoustic deterrent devices report that we had very constructive discussions with Marine Scotland. Different from the rest of the UK, there was a provision in the Act which established us that said once our strategic plan has been approved by Parliament, the clock starts ticking for the Scottish Government on carrying out a review of environmental governance in Scotland. So within 6 months of our producing our strategic plan and it being approved, and it was approved on the 1st of December, the Scottish Government has to embark on that review, which is wide-ranging, but must include consideration of the creation or otherwise of an environmental court. That review is beginning now, and I'm meeting with the people who are conducting that review, I think, in the next couple of weeks. And that will go on for the next 2 or 3 months. But by summer, I think we'll have had the Scottish Government's view on how they see the environmental governance landscape in Scotland emerging in the future. And I think that's something which will be of great interest beyond Scotland. The last 2 things I would say, first is a complementary thing. I think we've built over the year and a half or so that we've been going excellent relationships with NGOs and community groups. I want that to continue. And for those of you who are perhaps not yet engaged with us, please do so. We are very, very keen to engage and to listen and to be guided into areas where we can add value that we may not already have thought of ourselves or not been brought to us by others. So please, an open invitation to bring us in. The last thing I want to say is a concern. The UK government and Parliament have passed a piece of legislation and are considering another piece of legislation which will have significant impact on how we go about our business. The Internal Markets Act and the retained EU legislation bill, both in their own ways, undermine the ability of devolved administrations to act independently, and that will apply in environmental issues as well. I think there are great dangers for our ability to do our job in Scotland if the retained EU legislation bill is carried in its present form. We are quite clear that we've been established by legislation brought forward by the Scottish Government to the Scottish Parliament. And my board is very clear that we will continue to try to deliver on the Scottish statutory requirements that we have. And if that means that we are continually to point out in the future where constraints have been placed upon us to do the right thing for the environment by legislation made elsewhere, then that is what we will do. But please remember, environmental issues are pan-UK issues, even although we have different organisations in the 4 different parts of the United Kingdom. It is very important that we work together, and I think we can coalesce around opposition to this piece of legislation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and great to hear that your door is open to NGOs and other colleagues, and your very heartening commitment to transparency. I'm sure we'll come back to the Retained EU law revocation and reform in the questions, because it's something that's very much on our minds as well. So next, I'd like to invite Nerys Llewellyn-Jones, who's the Interim Environmental Protection Assessor for Wales, and her role is a little bit different, but she's going to tell us how and why it's different. Over to you, Nerys, and thank you.
Thank you, Ruth. Thank you very much as well for the opportunity to speak this afternoon and to highlight and perhaps talk a bit about what's happening in Wales. And as you mentioned there, the position is considerably different to the position in other parts of the UK. So I've been the AEPAW, or Interim Environmental Protection Assessor for Wales, for nearly 2 years, having been appointed on the 1st of March in 2021. And the interim assessor role was created really to bridge the environmental governance gap that was created when the UK left the European Union, and to make sure that the public had a mechanism for raising concerns about environmental law until a permanent kind of environmental oversight body is put in place. And the Welsh Government have recently committed as well to legislating to bring forward such a body during the current Senedd term. So my remit is different to, in those of other my counterparts in other parts of the UK, in that I'm looking at issues relating to the functioning of environmental law in Wales, and then provide advice to the Welsh ministers with a view to trying to improve environmental outcomes. So the functioning of environmental law could mean things such as whether the law is fit for purpose or is still relevant, that the information or explanatory material on the law is accessible, or indeed whether there are any barriers perhaps to the more practical implementation of the law. However, it's worth noting that my role doesn't really fully bridge perhaps the environmental governance gap that was created by Brexit, because it's a non-statutory role, and I can't investigate complaints about breaches of environmental law, and I can't take enforcement action either in relation to breaches. But as Jim was alluding to there earlier, isn't it? I think it's important that some of the concerns that are coming to myself, I'm able to highlight them perhaps to the relevant bodies. So it is that for that reason that a permanent body is needed in Wales, that would then, of course, then have the statutory powers to deal with breaches of the law. So in terms of what the initial focus has been and what's happened during that during my interim period to date, that's pretty much been focused on the establishment of the interim role, and ensuring that we had kind of robust processes in place to carry out the functions that we've been entrusted with. And since appointment, we've received 26 submissions from the public, which is considerably higher than what we originally envisaged would be the case. And they cover quite a wide range of topics, including forestry, water quality, hedgerow protection and management, protection of wildlife and nature, air quality, waste, access to environmental information. I could go on, isn't it? So there's quite a wide range of submissions being provided. And I'm currently working on various reports to Welsh ministers. Again, one that's already been mentioned is the implications of the Retained EU Law Revocation and Reform Bill 2022, and I'm in the process of finalising a very short kind of report in relation to that. Then on forestry, which will focus on tree protection, including tree preservation orders and felling licences. A report on hedgerow protection and management, which will include consideration of the hedgerow regulation 1997. We issued a call for evidence on protected sites, which is still underway. And we're also working on a report in relation to the use of civil sanctions in environmental law. The one area I have mentioned perhaps is, which we've received a lot of submissions on, is water quality, and that's a report that I'm looking to start working on in a couple of months' time. So with regard to kind of impact of my role, I think one of the key things has been engagement with stakeholders, and that has been really important to the work of the AEPAW so far, and it's really important that that engagement is at the forefront of the work that we do in the AEPW. So we hold quarterly online meetings. There's one on Friday. If anybody hasn't signed up to it yet, you're more than welcome to. We're very keen to hear feedback and comments and any questions or queries anybody has about the role or what we're doing. We're very keen to hear from anybody who's interested in being a part of that. And also engaged with the Welsh Senedd Climate Change, Environment and Infrastructure Committee (CCEI) about their inquiry on the operation of the interim environmental protection measures, and they published a report on the 28th of September last year, which made a series of recommendations in relation to my role, and also recommendations to the Welsh Government in relation to my role, and also the longer term plans for environmental governance in Wales. So it called for a review of the resources of my role, which is probably one of the challenges of the role to date, and the government's approach to responding to my reports and the plans as well for evaluating the interim measures. So my time so far has been very rewarding, but also challenging in terms of the following submissions and dealing with the matters that have been raised. But we're hopefully working towards creating a service that ensures that the concerns of the public about the functioning of environmental law in Wales is properly considered. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Norris, for that really clear and helpful explanation of the picture in Wales. And I'm sure that the audience will have some questions for you when we get to that section in a minute. So finally, for this part of the agenda, I'd like to invite Markham Beatty, who's the lead Northern Ireland non-executive director on the board of the Office for Environmental Protection. And in the beginning, of course, the OEP wasn't designed to cover Northern Ireland, but thankfully that remit was extended during the parliamentary process. So Malcolm, over to you, please, and thank you.
Thank you very much for inviting me to join you today, and greetings to everyone from Belfast. Northern Ireland came into the OEP in February, and I joined it a month later than that. And funding is still under negotiation. We got some, but as always, budgets are something we have to wrestle with. Something we have to bear in mind is that this is Westminster legislation that covers Northern Ireland, rather than something put through by our own assembly. And that means that most people are probably a little bit unsighted in what the Environmental Act actually does and what it's about. People would be aware here of something like the Climate Change Act, which did go through our assembly, and that has a bit more profile. I think we have a job then to say that other environmental issues are still important and have to be dealt with alongside. A big thing is it emphasises the independence of the OEP, both from Westminster and from Belfast administrations. Here, we have to be very careful that this is not an outside body coming in and telling the people here what's good for them. And I must say the OEP is doing very well building that kind of relationship with stakeholders, learning about how things work here, and it's not always straightforward. Understanding that this is a very small country, lots of issues around capacity and simply the availability of data, and all of that has to be worked through as we start to engage with what the problems are. We've been busy recruiting staff. I think we've something like 15 people based in Northern Ireland at the moment, but it's not a Northern Ireland office. It's very much the OEP covering the whole of England and Northern Ireland. Staff work across the whole spectrum of stuff, but because there are Northern Ireland people engaged with the OEP, we do have that perspective and are able to convey that. And I hope that it becomes something of value to both England and Northern Ireland. Things that we've been doing here. In the last 2 years, we've had 9 complaints. We've been able to work through those. 6 meet our criteria for dealing with complaints, and they're at an assessment stage. 8 of the complaints of the 9 are really about local authorities, and that's really focusing on environmental impact assessments and habitat regulations assessments, and how that was being dealt with when planning was devolved from central government to local government. The kind of issues coming up are very closely related to the current ammonia strategy, which is now out for consultation, and the OEP will be giving a view on that in due course. How we'll deal with that? Well, we will learn from the experience we developed in England. So last year we set out what our building blocks approach is, and we'll certainly try and apply that to Northern Ireland, because we think that will be helpful to the department and to the executive in due course. Other things we're doing, commissioning research into the areas that we feel that as an organisation we need to improve our understanding. I need to understand really the depth of the evidence that's there. Some big things are how good is the agri-environment scheme. Agriculture is a very big component of our economy here. How good are the agri-environment schemes that are actually delivering environmental improvement? And the other one, which comes up repeatedly whenever we do the household surveys, is illegal waste and litter and all of that impact on the environment. So that's something of public concern, and we're going to have a look at that. We're engaging with the department, with DAERA, in relation to their development of the Northern Ireland EIP. We've said it's something that they should get on with, but of course there are local politics here. We don't have an assembly, we don't have ministers anymore, so we have to work through just how all these things get out, get published. We start to look at the gaps in environmental governance. As I said, we're still waiting for the executive to adopt its environmental improvement plan. I don't know quite how that will happen, but there's a statutory deadline in the summer of this year. We think it's adequate, but politics is politics. We just have to work our way through that. We're also waiting for some policy statement on how environmental principles will be applied, and we'd look for cross-government buy-in. So whenever the Assembly here is, or the Executive here is producing its programme for government, we would expect to see some sort of statement recognising that the environment is important across all parts of government activity. Big challenges that we face, well, the understanding and working through the unique political circumstances here. What can we get on with? What can we push? And what might we just have to wait until other things get resolved? We also need to raise our profile. As I said in the beginning, I don't think the ordinary person in the street sees the environment as very much more than litter or a nice place to live. I think there are lots of nuances about biodiversity which are seen as very specialist and not really all that relevant. We need to actually increase the profile of that kind of thing. We do have the issue about the data. We need to just test that and see how good it is, how comprehensive it is, and that will give problems for us and for the civil service here trying to produce that information. We'll want to learn lessons that have been developed from an English context and just test that those can be applied and how those can be applied here. So there's a sense of, yes, this is relevant to Northern Ireland, it meets our needs and will make a difference to us. I think that's as much as I want to say at the moment. So thank you very much for letting me speak.
Thanks, Malcolm. That brings us then to an all-panel discussion. So if the panelists wouldn't mind coming back into the main event, as it were, and putting your cameras on, and then we will have a short conversation amongst the panel. Jim, if you could mute yourself, that would be great just for now. Thank you. And then we will go to the Q&A involving the audience. If you haven't been putting questions in, please start to think up questions. Some of them have been answered already, which is very efficient. Some of them are left for the live discussions. We'll come to those in a few minutes. So we'll have about 15 minutes for this section of the panel discussion. And the first question I wanted to put to each of you, if that's okay, is to look ahead in 5 years' time. And in 5 years, when you will all be in some way involved in the organisation that you're kind of part of now, I hope, how will you know that you've successfully delivered your missions? What will success look like for each of yourselves? So maybe if we could start with you, Jim, if that's okay, and then we'll come to Dame Glenys.
I doubt I'll be here in 5 years. I think my term only runs to 4, so it'll be someone else. But what I hope they will have achieved. I think the first thing that any organisation like my own has to do is establish credibility, and I hope that we are on the track to doing that. But I hope that in 5 years, and whatever the new environmental governance landscape is for Scotland, and I would sincerely hope it is not the one that we have now, that we will have improved awareness, that we will improve the performance of public bodies in terms of their environmental policies and their actions, that environmental law in Scotland will be seen not only to be effective, but to be a world leader. In order to do that, we'll have to be aware that we need to look out with the United Kingdom as well as within the United Kingdom for our benchmarks. I think also I would like us to be seen as an authoritative body, and I would hope that we're part of a landscape, and this may be something that we come on later, where there is greater access for individuals and for bodies like NGOs to bring the concerns that they have and have them answered properly. I think that we very often pay lip service to wanting to be accessible, but I don't think currently in Scotland, or with respect to my colleagues in the rest of the United Kingdom, that we're as accessible as we could be. And so I'd hope that in 5 years' time, there's an environmental governance model in Scotland which has involvement and accessibility at its heart, and quality and efficiency in its outputs.
Thanks, Jim. Dame Glenys?
Thank you very much indeed. Oh no, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Yeah, carry on.
Thank you. I wasn't quite clear. So this is a question, what does success look like? It's a question I asked every candidate to be a board member of the OEP. So Malcolm might be able to remember what on earth he said when he had to answer it, but it's not a straightforward one, is it? I've just made some notes of my own thinking. First of all, we're expecting that new EIP, and in 5 years' time, we'll be expecting another one, won't we? I'm hoping that this EIP that's coming will be iterative, that government will be right on top of it. Certainly, we would make every effort to be right on top of it, and where it needs to iterate, would provide advice to do so. But one of the tests for us is when we get to that 5 years and the next EIP is coming, how good is that? How good is that? It's such an important matter for us. Secondly, we would expect to see sufficient progress against the statutory targets and any other targets that are set by government, apex targets within its EIP, for example. We must be able to influence that. Surely, we need to get that foresight, develop that foresight so we can advise government in good time if it's at risk of not making sufficient progress, if things aren't happening as they should or not happening sufficiently urgently. So for me, a good indicator for our success will be if we're on track as a government, in relation to those interim targets and the trajectory is right. A couple of other things. One is, and you'd expect a lawyer to say this, but I don't expect to be caught short on any legal matter. Yes, there are legal complexities in relation to any type of enforcement, starting from the day that you start your investigation. And we can expect within that 5 years to be challenged legally one way or another. I expect the auditor to be present itself credibly and to be not found wanting, let's put it that way, in anything that we do. Then I think the other and last thing I would say is just we have a wide breadth of powers, and we've set out to tackle the right issues, the most important issues, using whichever powers best suit. It might just be one, doing a Section 29 report, or it might be giving advice to government. What I'd like to be able to look back on over that 5 years is that as an organisation, we have used our full range of powers to best effect. We've chosen the issue, and then we found our own unique contribution and used our range of powers to make that contribution. And that would make me a happy bunny. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Malcolm, would you like to add anything from a Northern Ireland perspective?
Yes, but not to repeat what I said at interview with Dame Glenys, because I can't remember. For me, the things I'd like to see are changes in cultural values. I'd like the Northern Ireland ministers and the civil service to really value our advice, and I'd like to see that they're doing something about it and starting to act on it. I'd like our population to be confident that whenever they complain to us, we're dealing with their concerns and their complaints properly, rigorously, and that something good and beneficial comes out of that. And I'd like industry to see environment as something that's to be valued and cherished and not simply a compliance cost. Thank you.
Thanks, Malcolm. And finally on this one, Nerys, and with the best will in the world, we really hope that you're not in your role in 5 years' time, because something would have gone very awry on the hunt for a permanent arrangement. But looking ahead, what would you think would be success for Welsh governance in, say, 5 years' time?
So, as you said, I mean, my role is continuing for another year, confirmed as an interim measures, and I don't know what's happening after that, but one would hope that we would have a permanent body within that 5 years, but not just a permanent body established, but one which is beyond that fledgling stage, which Dennis was talking about earlier, isn't it? But one which is, you know, well established and which is a trusted, you know, kind of environmental protection oversight body for Wales, isn't it, which the public have got complete confidence in, isn't it? So that would be my hope in relation to that. But I think in terms of when you're doing any piece of work where you're putting recommendations in there, for me, the big test is if actions have actually happened as a result of those recommendations being forward. And I think what I want to see is that action and those deliverables taking place, you know, within public bodies, but also on the ground as well in terms of environmental protection. So that would be my wish, isn't it? So in 5 years' time, even if I'm not directly involved, I think that's what I'd be looking at, isn't it? Is what's happened actually on the ground and in terms of environmental protection in Wales.
Thanks, Nerys. And that takes us neatly on to the next question, actually, which is how do we all collectively, yourselves, us in the NGO community, other partners in the business community and elsewhere, help government convert ambition into action? Because it is action that we need. Some partners have talked about this needing to be a decade of delivery. What do you think your role in encouraging, requiring, pushing, cajoling government ambition conversion into action can be? And I know that's another kind of hard question. Dame Glenys, can we come to you first on that one, please?
Thank you. And yes, what a tough question that is. So just, I mean, in a sense, I think we've set out as we mean to go on at the OEP. It is a combination of providing evidence-based and expert advice. And, you know, we've, I think, got a reasonable record of that and we'll want to always build on it. But advice that is respected, that is, as I say, evidence-based and sufficiently detailed, actually. So it's a strategic piece of advice in a sense, but it has sufficient detail to enable it to be acted upon. I think continuing to do that. Yes, doing the annual reporting that we must do on government's progress. Yes, continuing to assist all parliamentarians and others in understanding the state of the environment and the state of governance around it. I do think relationships will remain important. So here we are a year in, and I'm not aware that we've actually fallen out with anybody yet. I'm relieved about that because relationships matter, and we will wish to be seen by government and by all of the departments and other public bodies that we oversee as not just a pain, but a more formal type of critical friend, if you like. Our overriding ambition is to see government meet its own ambitions for the environment. So I think relationships at all levels really do matter there. And here I'm not talking just about relationships with government, but relationships with those arm's length bodies that are the main delivery bodies for this, and also relationships with a wide range of interested environmentalists and other stakeholders. And I think we need to continue to sort of work hard at that without being captured. You know, this is a really interesting line for us and my colleagues across the UK to walk. You know, we mustn't be captured by a government or by any individual department or agency, but equally we must not be captured by other stakeholders as well. We need to always ground ourselves in what is important, what is serious, what is urgent, and where is the evidence. And we will need to keep walking that line. I actually think our biggest challenges, Malcolm, will be in Northern Ireland. You know, the Northern Ireland, as we get to understand it more, us English folk, you know, people's attitude to the environment is different. The environmental issues are just as complex here, but sometimes much more embedded. And of course, the politics are so darn difficult, even when they work, you know. So I can see, if you like, that we might have some particularly testing times in Northern Ireland as we gather strength there and start to deliver our programme of work. I'll stop there, but I have every hope that by a combination of using the breadth of our powers in the best way that we think possible, we can make a difference. Otherwise, what is the point?
Thanks,
I should end by saying that if we don't make enough difference, if we find ourselves not making enough difference, we need to regroup in the OEP and actually ask ourselves why, you know, and is our strategic approach right? Or because often organizations start and within 3 years realize that their strategic approach obviously needs to get thrown out completely, or, you know, there needs to be a little adjustment, a change of course. We're not proud, you know, if we don't actually get this right, we will do that fundamental relook. But at the moment, we think our approach is good, but, you know, it's early days. Thank you.
Thanks. Malcolm, do you want to add anything from Northern Ireland OEP perspective?
The only thing I would add, I think, is we need to always keep focusing on what's achievable. It may be highly desirable, but if we can't actually make the progress and measure it so that people get confidence in us, I think our strategy is not right.
Thanks. And this was your question really that I stole from you. How about the Welsh context? What do you think are some of the essential ingredients in helping Welsh government and other actors actually drive action forward?
I mean, we're very lucky in ways. I mean, we're a small nation in comparison. And we know, stakeholders know each other very well as well, isn't it? So I think, you know, collaborative working is really, really important. And I think it's a way of, you know, Malcolm was talking about it's reality checking what is achievable and what can be done, isn't it? And in a practical sense as well. So I think that's really important. I think we're very fortunate actually in ways in terms of the existing relationships that we already have and the way that we're able to work towards those common goals and ambitions.
Thanks. And Jim, finally on this one.
I'm afraid I don't really see our organisation's primary role as being to advise government. Our role is to carry out the statutory functions that we have. And in the context of this question, the two, I think, areas where we will add value for government is by assessing where environmental law is ineffective and bringing that to their attention, to Parliament's attention, to broader public attention and to NGOs, and requiring the government to address that. And also in areas where there are gaps in environmental law that need to be filled. So I don't see us so much as advisors, as a little burr under the government's saddle, keeping the government focused on where they should be making policy, rather than advising them on how to fine-tune policy ideas that they have brought forward. Although we will probably do a bit of that as well. And I think in the area where this probably differentiates Scotland from the other three jurisdictions will be in the areas around keeping pace with particularly EU progress and international progress. And I think that will be important. But it will also be important that for each of our organisations that we understand clearly what's happening in each of our jurisdictions, because these policy issues tend to be cross-border. So I think it's important that we keep the door open to NGOs and other bodies to be listening about where we should be focusing our activity, and then translating that into saying to government and other public bodies, these are areas where we think you need to improve, rather than becoming yet another body inputting to a policy discussion and becoming one voice among many.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks all. So we could carry on this discussion for a long time, but I'd like to try now and get through as many of the questions that colleagues in the audience have been putting forward. So I won't put them to all of you just for the sake of time, but obviously if you've got a strong view and want to chip in and answer, then please do. So the first question is from Becky Spate, Chief Executive of the RSPB. Each of your bodies has a number of capabilities it can exercise, and you're starting to do so. But from your experience so far, in your view, which has made the most difference to the environment? Start with you, Jim, if that's okay, and then we'll go to Dame Glenys.
I think our initial report, improvement report that we issued to the Scottish Government on the monitoring of air quality will, in the long run, provided that the Scottish Government's proposals that they bring forward in the next few weeks are going to be effective, will have a long-lasting and direct effect in Scotland and in the monitoring of air quality and in the governance of that. But also, I think the fact that our very first improvement report is gone right to the heart of an issue which the European courts have been trying to get Scottish and UK governments to take action on for the last, I think, 16 or 17 years. That within 1 year, we've managed to get an improvement report, which has required the Scottish Government to go to the Scottish Parliament for approval of improvements they bring forward. I think that will be our first major achievement, I think.
Thanks, Jim. Dame Glenys, what's made the biggest difference?
Thank you. So it's a difficult question to answer because it's still very early days for each of these bodies, actually. And, you know, many of us will have specific things underway that aren't yet coming to fruition. I'm thinking here, for example, about the investigation we've got underway into the roles and responsibilities of Ofwat, the Secretary of State and the Environment Agency in relation to the management and oversight of combined sewage overflows. You know, we will get to the end of that this year, but of course it's in progress at the moment and I can't talk very much about it. So early days, there are a lot of things, you know, in the pipeline, if you like, but not sort of coming up. But thinking, just stepping back from that immediacy, I think our annual monitoring report, you know, setting out government's progress in relation to meeting its own ambitions will always be a significant piece of work and we will get better at it. So, you know, I'm very proud of our report. You know, I'm really proud and pleased with it, but it's been developed at a time when we were still building the team that does most of the work from that. So we have opportunities as we mature to really develop that report and perhaps, for example, take in any 1 year, one particular area, species decline, for example, and really do an in-depth study. And so I'm really hoping that those reports will be long anticipated and will be significant and influential. Then the other thing we've found, and I wasn't sure how this would work actually as we started, but in the 12 months that we have been working, we have given a significant amount of, I think, quite evidence-based, detailed and helpful advice to government and to wider Parliament. Now, I hadn't seen quite how we could assist wider Parliament. And that's really important as wider Parliament and its committees then scrutinise the work of government and its agencies and departments. So I think that will continue to be important for us, actually, that we give the right advice at the right time without kind of straying from our remit. You know, we do take care to make sure that when we decide to do a piece of work, it is because it's within our remit and because we can make the difference needed rather than another body. But yes, I point to those things, but it's early days and time will tell, won't it? Thank you.
Thank you, and definitely a question that we'll come back to in future events of this nature. Do you want to say anything about this one, Nerys, or should we go on to the next? Carry on.
Yeah, I think it's very, very early days, and I'd be very cautious about claiming to have had any impact in terms of anything without being able to measure that and provide substantive evidence to that as well, isn't it? So I think it's very, very early days, isn't it? And I think it's a challenge for all of us actually to be able to demonstrate where that impact has been and that difference has been made in terms of the work that we're doing.
Thank you. So I'll move on to the next question, which is from Pippa Neal from the ENDS report, and it's about a hot topic, which is the retained EU law revocation and reform bill, or the rule bill. Pippa says that, Jim, you mentioned in your remarks that the rule bill could impact on ESS's ability to do your job. Could you expand on this a little bit? And then I'll really ask the same question of the other panelists. What are your concerns about the impact that the rule bill could have on your abilities to do your jobs? But let's start with you, Jim, if that's okay.
There we go. Thank you. I couldn't unmute myself there, and many people in this organisation for a long time have been trying to find a mute button for me. Maybe they'll learn from this. The rule bill, particularly when it's taken alongside the Internal Markets Act, will directly affect our ability, because one of the functions that we have is to assess whether or not the Scottish Government is keeping pace with legislation and plans in Europe and internationally for the environment. And I think taking these two pieces of legislation together, there's a severe danger that the Scottish Government might be constrained in its ambition to do that. And there may well be internal political constraints in Scotland that arise, but this is a direct external threat to their ability to do that. That then places a question mark over our organisation's ability to realistically hold the government to account for something which they would not be able to do because of the legislation that had been passed. And that sets up a constitutional conundrum, of which we have many at the moment. But from our point of view, we're losing an awful lot of good legislation in this bill, a wholesale bonfire of legislation, which I don't think has been properly assessed. We will probably take the view, when this bill, that it goes through, becomes an act, that we will continue to do what we do until stopped by someone. And I genuinely hope that the two pieces of legislation do not, as I fear, bring us to a lowest common denominator in environmental legislation and policy. Because it should be important, with a devolved settlement in the 4 different parts of the United Kingdom, for us to progress at different paces. And that is very healthy, because it encourages others to legislate up rather than legislate down on environmental issues. So I see real dangers in here, which I'm sure I'm preaching to the choir, I know that, but we all need to do our best to make sure that these issues get more common currencies, that people understand the dangers that we face.
Thanks, Jim. Nerys, you mentioned you've recently done a call for evidence on the impact of rule. Would you like to say anything about that?
So there will be a report published in relation to this in the coming weeks from a Welsh perspective, isn't it? But I think there's common ground probably between us in terms of our views in relation to this. But I won't go into perhaps some of the recommendations. But I think there is common ground with some of what Jim was saying there, and what the position is in Wales as well.
Thank you. Malcolm, from a Northern Ireland perspective, how much is the Return to You law bill on the kind of the agenda and the horizon? And would you like to say anything about it?
It's seen as a fairly big problem here. I'll give you a very parochial example. A farmer on the border, on each side of the border, will have quite different environmental standards in a due course if they diverse, and that's very hard to sell to people. Why should I, as a farmer managing my livestock in this way, have to do it in a different way from that farmer over there? We're both selling into the same market, and all of that kind of cost and administrative burden then becomes a real nightmare. It's hard to understand, and I just hope that sense prevails somewhere.
Finally, Dame Glenys, on this one, you mentioned you've put written evidence into the Bill Committee, but would you like to summarise your concerns?
So yes, we put evidence into the Bill Committee back in November, actually, and we sent a summary of that to all relevant departments as well, so as to get our point across. We have common concerns, don't we, all of us, about the scope and nature of this. We think there are about 1,200 pieces of legislation on DEFRA's list at the moment, and it's still not complete. It does look eye-watering, doesn't it, with a December 23 cut-off point. We made recommendations in our advice, which I hope you'd all agree with. So the sunset date and the retained EU law bill, the end of 23 date, ought to be reconsidered and extended in our view because it's not practical or workable, and there are such risks with rushed review. Secondly, we think an environmental regression safeguard should be added. There is an environmental regression safeguard in the LERB bill, but not here, and we don't quite understand why not, as it will provide a fair bit of assurance. We want that comprehensive list of what is covered by rule, what falls under the scope, and then we want government to provide evidence of any proposed change. Actually, what is the rationale for the change, and where's the evidence to suggest that change is needed? And then we want, it's a related point, but we want clarity over the process to be followed, not just by DEFRA, but by others as they try and implement this and aren't they already sort of trying to review their legislation. I have to say that DEFRA has not been unhelpful to us here, that this is a priority for us. We've got a specific small team in our organisation focused entirely on it and looking at what we think to be the priorities and really working and having a good relationship alongside the work DEFRA is doing, not participating in it, but actually being able to see for the moment at least what the provisional kind of approach is. So I'm hoping that it feels a bit at the moment like sort of man marking in a football game, but we hope to develop that into something as constructive as possible as the bill is enacted. It's still, of course, to go through the House of Lords, and I'm imagining we'll have a bit of a bun fight there, don't you? I would be surprised if it doesn't have quite a rough ride through the House. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. And House of Lords' second reading for the rule bill is confirmed as the 6th of February. So I think that live debate, which we all expect will start pretty soon. The next question is from Pip Goodwin, and it's about one of the most important issues facing us as environmentalists, and that's the commitments made under the international framework agreed at Montreal for biodiversity. Biodiversity is obviously a devolved issue. So how do you think that you as 4 or 3 oversight bodies can work together to ensure that collectively the UK's ambitions on nature match what was agreed at Montreal? I don't know who would like to start with this one. Maybe you, Dame Glenys, if that's okay.
Yeah, I will, because I'll say the easy things and leave others to deal with the difficult bits. So, it's hot off the press, isn't it, really? And sitting alongside those statutory environmental targets as well, I do think, we have established working relationships between us, ESS and NERIS, and it's be top of the agenda, won't it? How do we reconcile these things? The commitments are very wide, as I understand it, international commitments. Of course, it's part of a bigger picture where we've got any number of historical international commitments without sufficient clarity all the time about which ones we're still trying as a nation to achieve. So I think it's a matter high up on the agenda for us as we meet at working level to discuss how we're going to tackle things, but we haven't had that discussion yet, as far as I'm aware. Thank you.
Nerys, has this come up in your work programme?
So we have had a biodiversity deep dive in Wales, which the Welsh Government obviously have undertaken, isn't it? So, and I'm obviously not part of that work, isn't it? But that has happened in Wales, isn't it? But in terms of my role is now, as Dame Glenys Stacey was saying, there, very keen to work collaboratively, isn't it, in terms of looking at how we can address some of the kind of targets and matters that were put within that report.
Malcolm, if you could maybe add a Northern Ireland perspective, bearing in mind the difficulties of not being able to move forward with policies on these sorts of issues at the moment.
Well, yeah, that's an issue that will get resolved one way or other in due course. Remember, of course, we've been devolved effectively since 1920, so we have a lot of experience in actually handling this kind of international agreement. It gets translated into our domestic legislation and into our programs in a way that best suits our circumstances. So it's a thing that I think people will embrace and try and find a way of giving a perspective on that makes sense to us. It doesn't particularly fill with any horrors or anything.
Thank you, everybody. So I think we've got time for two more questions, hopefully. So one from Jeffrey Lean. Encouraging the government to achieve its environmental ambitions, which Dame Glenys described as her goal, seems in itself to be rather unambitious. Should you not be seeking to increase them? So slightly provocative challenge to finish, but maybe Dame Glenys, let's pitch that one at you. Thank you.
Okay, so government's stated commitment, I think it was first in its manifesto over 10 years ago, is to leave the environment in a better state for the next generation. You know, that is not insignificant, I don't think, as a start point. Secondly, I would say that some of the targets, the statutory targets that have recently been agreed, are suitably ambitious and they're not easy to achieve. So if we take sort of the ecological status of water environments or the species abundance target, you know, that's eye-watering actually, to try and get to a point of stopping decline by 2030. But it won't be enough. It won't be enough because the decline has been so significant, you know, 82% over the last half century, and, you know, an equal amount, if you like, the same rate of decline over the last 5 years of measurement until 2018, actually stopping it and even kind of increasing species abundance by 10% is only just a little thing, actually, in terms of when you compare it to where we were half a century ago. So it seems to me this is about turning the ship as quickly as possible, making sure that those ambitious targets are met, or we are on course, government is on course to meeting them, and where we think more ambition is needed in order to stop decline or else protect and enhance the environment to a suitable extent, we press for it. I hope you don't think that we are lacking ambition. I don't feel that myself, and maybe I could have expressed that differently, but, you know, some of those targets are pretty ambitious. We want a plan now and we want them delivered.
Jim, same question to you.
My ambitions are not really the UK government's ambitions. What I'm hoping is that we can raise people's expectations of government rather than government's expectation of itself. And part of that in Scotland is the keeping pace power that we have, so that we can try to get Scotland to the position where internationally we are seen as world leaders. Now that is an ambitious target for where we are, and there are many constraints in the way. I think how we can do that, what we can do to get us there, is to continually be pointing out where there are international developments and developments in the rest of the United Kingdom, which the Scottish Government should be aspiring to, so that it should be an evolving target that the government has set, rather than a date-constrained target with a set of numbers against it. So I see our role as holding the government's feet to the fire on their stated aim to make Scotland a world leader in environmental matters.
Thanks, Jim. So just to wrap up this session then, I'd like each of you to say one or two sentences in response to the final question, which is from me actually, so I'm going to take the chair's prerogative. But basically looking at, you know, the reports that we have that you've all been doing, the news on the environment, you know, the chronic decline in biodiversity that the OEP found, other kind of environmental sort of bad news stories, it's quite easy as people working for a better environmental future to become disheartened, to lose the faith, to think about, you know, what is going to make a difference. So as an environmental community, what message would you have for us about, you know, the importance of continuing to do what you're doing and what we're doing? So basically a message of hope and inspiration. Not an easy thing to do in one or two sentences, but I'm going to ask you to try anyway. Nerys, let's start with you.
I think we're embarking on a period of what would be regarded as transformational change. And I think that's the way we should be looking at it. And change is difficult. You know, we can't get away from that. But I think, you know, we've got to be looking at it from that point of view and thinking strategically about a longer term position, isn't it? But we are certainly on the cusp of transformational change, I think.
Thanks, Nerys. Malcolm?
I think I would say keep to the faith. I've had a long career working on land-based industries. I've seen a lot of very good change, particularly in my own field, which is forestry. It's a different industry from it was when I started. I think the same is possible to achieve in agriculture and fishing, but we need to keep working at it. We need to tell people and remind people it's really important and it's worth doing.
Jim?
For NGOs in particular, I think what I've been really, really encouraged by is your ability to act collectively. And I think that mustn't be lost. That is a very, very powerful weapon that you have to act collectively. I think we all need to work harder to engage with ordinary people and make this not an enlightened issue, but an everyday issue for everybody. And I think lots of NGOs are doing good work in that area. And I also think we're winning. I think we're winning. And very often, I don't hear people say that. But I think in so many areas and so many issues, we are winning. So be confident.
Thanks, Jim. And finally, Dame Glenys.
You've given me the last word, Ruth.
I'm going to have the last word, so but you carry on for now. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So where do we see signs of hope? Well, I know that we said in our monitoring report that things that are organised well tend to actually get delivered, more like to be delivered. And I was looking recently actually about the position on air quality. So yes, there are issues, aren't there? And there are some particular challenges in our urban centres. But what you can see there is coherent policy. There is coherent policy in relation to air quality. Local authorities are fully engaged or generally engaged, and they seem to know what they're doing, when they're actually monitoring and delivering. So what you've got there is coherent policy and well-organised delivery. And that's what we need all of us to continue to press for. If you compare that with bathing waters, where you've got, if you look beneath the bonnet, if you like, there, you've got some pretty dated targets. The aim is for our bathing quality, water quality to be sufficient, not good. And yet the way people use those waters and when they use those waters has changed a lot. So it's not just now about having a paddle on Blackpool Beach, is it? And yet the monitoring is only over the sort of summer period. So there you've got a position where you, underneath the bonnet, you can see a number of problems. You don't see coherent policy with the delivery arrangements there to make sure it's well delivered. And personally, that's what I will be pressing for in these areas. And I would hope that all of us can be alert to that. When we identify a problem, I always ask my staff to ask 3 questions: why, and why. And if you can ask yourself those questions, you'll find a route to making a difference. And I think that's really what we've all got to do. But it's particularly incumbent, I have to say, on the oversight bodies represented here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Dame Glenys. And I'm going to use my last word really just to say thank you to the panellists to start. So Dame Glenys, Malcolm, Jim and Nerys. Thank you to Sophia and Siri behind the scenes actually making all of this work today, which has been brilliant. And thank you to you, the audience, for joining, bearing with us as we started a bit late and we're 3 minutes over now. It's been a really engaging and rich discussion. Sorry we didn't get through all of the questions, but hopefully we managed to get through enough of them to give you a good flavour of the brilliant work that the oversight bodies are doing. Do play your part, do be a live part of that conversation, and keep up the brilliant work. Thanks for joining, and we'll see you all soon.